picture of our faith, right? But then also the passage tells us that the Father finishes for us. I'm restating what I said before. The Father gives the law, right? And then the Father tells us where we should go, gives the law, but then He also shows us how to get there, right? He doesn't just simply say, go there, you're on your own. Enjoy the trip, you know? He doesn't say that. He says, all right, here's where you need to go, and guess what? I'm going to show you how to get there. How does He do that? It says that Christ perfects our faith, enduring hardship, pain, and suffering, right? The pathway that we have to be like God is going to be one of pain and suffering, not just because of other people. Sometimes other people bring us pain and suffering, right? But sometimes we bring pain and suffering on ourselves because we are not perfect sons. We are not perfect daughters before God, right? So God is there while we are trying to figure out how can we be like Christ. God is there. The Father is there showing us the way. And if you listen to God, and if you ask God to show you wisdom, the Father will not ignore you. Right? The Father does not ignore His child. And so He'll show you the way. So Christ suffered the pain of the world, and now He sits beside the Father in a place of honor. Right? When Christ... I see my problem. I'm not looking at the same slide I have up here. Because when Christ died for us, there you go. When Christ died for us, He completed the task of our reconciliation with the Father. Do you see that? The story is already over. Right? Why? Because God is powerful. And God has the power to do this. He's already written the book. That's what we mean when we say that God is the author. We're going to talk about that a little bit next week when we say that God is creator. But God has already written the story for creation. He's already written the story for our lives. He knows the end of the story. And He knows that His promises to us will hold true because He's already finished it. His Son completely purged away the sin of the world when He died on the cross. All the sin of mankind has already been atoned for, even though in our space-time frame we haven't seen all the human sin that is to come. Okay? We know that in the last days there will be an outpouring of human sin. And so we know that we have not seen the end of sin. And we know that we can expect that we will sin sometime this week. Before we meet again, all of us in this room will probably have sinned again. Right? But those sins are already paid for. Right? Christ has already done that. Right? So the Father is the person who sets our eyes on the right goal, and then He says, I'm also going to show you how to get there. Right? So He finishes for us. But then also the Father is our present help. But we also know, the story is finished. God has done all the work. But we also know this. The work is not finished. Right? Like I said, we know we're going to sin again. Right? The story is not finished. We are in this reality. We're in this reality. Does knowing the end really bring us any comfort? I'm sorry, I know that sometimes for some people, knowing the end of the story is not enough. Right? Sometimes our circumstances are really bad. Sometimes our circumstances are really awful. We see beautiful examples. 2 weeks ago, one of my close friends' mother died, and actually I was kind of friends with the whole family. And she was, I think, 57, 58 years old. She died of cancer. And it was one of those situations where you sort of envy it. It's like, oh wow, if we could have that kind of death, I think anybody would want that kind of death. It was a great death. It was a wonderful death. She went out with people around her who loved her. The family was blessing God and giving thanks to God for her wonderful life, and she even wrote her own obituary. Right? She knew she was dying, and she had about a week of severe pain before she died, and she wrote her own obituary. And in her obituary she said, "My life was a testimony to my cluelessness and God's unfailing providence." Right? And you just think, that's a great death, But we've also seen those deaths which are not great. And we also have seen those places where sin has so thoroughly perverted the life of a human that we think, is it really enough, right? Is it really enough to know that the story is finished? You know, my uncle died 3 months ago, and he was a man who lived an awful life. He had a horrible life. He was a criminal. He was always involved in small crime, drugs, and stealing things. He had just that horrible life, and the pain that he brought on everybody around him, particularly his parents, but also his brothers and sisters and my dad. It was just a stark contrast to me. And so sometimes we see God's hand in people's life and we say, that's wonderful. They have a great life and they have a great death. Their story ended well. But then we see other people and we say, their life was awful. Is it really enough to know that God is the eternal Father with the power to save? Is it really enough to know that? This passage says it is, right? Because this passage says that when we are discouraged, what should we do? We should consider him who endured such opposition from men. What did Christ endure? I'm pretty sure whatever Christ endured is stronger and more powerful than what we have ever endured. Right? I'm pretty sure. We don't know what it is. We don't know. We can describe it intellectually. We can say that all of the sins of the world were put on his shoulders. We can say that God turned his back upon his own son because he couldn't look upon his son's sin. We can say all of these things about it intellectually, but really we don't know, right? We don't know the depth of what it was that Christ suffered. And this passage even asks us, in the next verse, have you struggled in your fight against sin? Have you struggled to the point of shedding your blood? Right? Jesus did. Jesus shed his blood. He shed his blood even before he was condemned to execution, even before his trial. Right? Jesus was out in the garden praying, shedding his blood because he was praying so hard. Right? All because of anticipation of what it was that he was about to do. So whatever we suffer, we know that Christ has suffered far worse. Right? So we know that when the Father asks us to suffer, and when the Father asks us to discipline, he's not asking us to do something that he himself has not done. Right? He has already done that in the person of his Son, Jesus. Right? He has already done that for us. So when we are discouraged and when we're suffering, look to him. It was what my Togyo said to me this week. Yes, you don't get to complain because you're Oren. We know that sometimes our suffering is great, but we also know that other people suffer greater than us. And so what do? We say, I really shouldn't talk about it. It's best not to talk about it, right? Don't display your suffering to Christ. Christ is there to help your suffering, but you can't go to Christ and say, hey, you've never felt this. Why do you do this to me? That's not true, right? Because whatever you have suffered, Christ has suffered more. Whatever you are feeling, whatever pain you are feeling, God himself has taken that same pain upon himself, right? That's what a father does, right? If there were some way that I could take Kansugi's pain away this morning on his little scabbed knee, of course I would do that. That's not even a question, It's even absurd to ask the question. Of course I would take that pain away from him if I could, but I can't. But the reason I can't is because I'm human. But God could. He can take our pain on himself, and he did in the form of his Son, Jesus. So, what do we say about the Father? A father is the person who does not simply make the story end well. We see that in this passage. The story ends well. We will be united with Christ, right? But the Father is also the person who writes the story with us. He stands beside us, and he writes the story with us, and he walks beside us all the way to the end of our life. And he's there waiting for us. Right? So I hope, I felt a little bit disorganized today, but I hope at least you have some sense of what the Father heart is, and I hope that you have some appreciation for the Father Heart of God.